Hey everybody, welcome to episode 5 of a Good Run podcast with Daniel Feldman. I'm Asher Feldman. On today's podcast, we talked about Dan Feldman's experience in the late 60s at Columbia University, and particularly the student protests that happened in 68, and his involvement, what he did, how he was part of the protest, what he saw, his viewpoint on how things bubbled up and then over the side of the pot to really get things started up there, and just kind of the way that the university interacted with what was happening in the country at large and how that all kind of tumbled into what became a very notable point in New York City history.
Hey everybody, this is Leah Feldman. I'm just curious about this particular instance. Seemed to be really influential for a lot of people. Everyone who was involved, really looks back on that moment as one of change, sort of like a corner being turned. But I wonder, in this conversation, were you able to sort of decipher what it is that Dan was bringing to the protest? Like, what is it that he thought he was contributing or felt he was contributing with his presence there?
Yeah, I mean, I think he talked a lot about how the people that he saw involved in either side of the problems that they saw as being important to address and discuss, kind of how their shifting viewpoints, shifting emotions would either reinforce what they believed or change what they believed as they saw something come to fruition that they had been thinking about or talking about for so long. But he really noted his ability to kind of debate with people of any side of any kind of issue and help them better understand also what they were thinking. He was obviously very set in his thoughts, but as a classic liberal, able to adopt new ideas if he is presented with new information. But he really valued his ability to talk with all of these different viewpoints, incorporate them, kind of try to shed light on a little bit of a different viewpoint, and just deepen the conversation, really. He saw himself as a deepener of conversation.
So even a professor, when he was still a college student.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it comes out every time we talk about his professorial ways, even way back then.
Awesome.
All right, so enjoy this episode of A Good Run with Daniel Feldman, and we'll see you next week. Our 5th podcast. This time we're going to talk a little bit about the late 60s and kind of your involvement in and the way that you saw the political kind of ecosystem upend itself in that era. So I think as a good place to start, entering Columbia University as a freshman in 1966, what was the overriding or kind of general feeling politically that you saw reflected either on the campus or nationally that was kind of informing the way people started to interact with, feel about, think about politics?
Well, in the fall of 66, which is when I started college, first of all, when I first arrived, I really wasn't thinking too much about politics. I was thinking about getting accustomed to being a college student.
Right.
But secondly, the Vietnam War was emerging, but I use the word emerging carefully, and I'm going to explain what I mean by that. Was beginning, really, I'd say beginning to emerge as a major point of controversy and contention. That is, there were people like myself and my family who were already questioning the war, but nationally it was just the anti-war movement was really small at that point and had not really achieved any kind of impact level nationally or at Columbia for that matter. But this was exactly the growth period. It was exponential growth of that anti-war movement beginning right then, so that by 67, it had, from 66 to 67 was a tremendous increase in anti-war activity, anti-war consciousness. Mm. And so certainly people like myself were not really even thinking in terms of, violent protests in '66. Wouldn't have occurred to me even. So that I was involved in as a minor foot soldier in the efforts of some more traditionally politically active Columbia students to really take over the Reform Democratic clubs on the West Side. The earlier generation of reformers was considered not reform enough, so, or maybe, I think the anti-war thing might have begun to be a little part of it, but so I went to the clubs to try to vote for my senior Columbia friends who were active. The groundwork for that had been laid some time ago. Bob Abrams was already a member of the Assembly. He graduated for Columbia some years earlier, later became borough president and attorney general in New York. What's his name? Frank Baroff was a Democratic district leader. He had graduated from Columbia a few years earlier. And there were people who worked with them who were trying to take over them. So that was my political involvement at that time. I did have friends in SDS, but the SDS is an excellent example. Students for Democratic Society was the really left-wing organization that spearheaded the big college protests. When I came to Columbia, the president of Columbia's chapter was a fellow named Ted Kapchik, who was this sort of dreamy, Tibetan studies major, lovely guy, nice, kindly guy, but not, certainly no Jacobin. I mean, no, revolutionary. He might have thought he was, but he wasn't. He was succeeded, however, by Mark Rudd, who was a disciplined, kind of cold-eyed, and some might say cold-hearted political strategist who thought that violent confrontation was going to be useful. Now, the steering committee of SDS at the time included 3 people that I had personal connections with and friendly connections. Robbie Roth had been at the Mount Herman School with me on an NSF program when we were both in high school. Stu Goodell was a debater from some other New York City high. I think he was maybe Stuyvesant, I'm not sure. So I encountered him in some debate thing we had when I was in high school. And Ann Hoffman was in the same advanced calculus class I was in. So I was friendly with all 3 and argued with all 3. Mm-hmm. Although my degree of consciousness of the war in Vietnam, for example, became more intense as time went on, I believe my political point of view stayed pretty much the same. Because I do remember arguing with Stewie and Robbie and Ann from my perspective, which was kind of a liberal reform Democrat as opposed to maybe communist revolutionary. Mm-hmm. I was not a big fan of violent revolution. The American Revolution I was in favor of, but, but I just felt that incremental reform was more effective.
So I'm interested to know, obviously you guys are somewhat obviously as part of New York City or living in New York City, you're very tangential, like the culture is happening right there. The journalism is happening right there. The political action is happening right there. But I wonder, how does news and opinion and kind of thought leadership make its way onto a college campus, or how did it make its way onto a college campus at that time? Because obviously no social media, no internet. I mean, people were learning by word of mouth, right? Or via newspaper.
Yes.
So that was overwhelmingly how people began to change or inform or learn more about their political opinions.
Yes, that's certainly absolutely right. Mm-hmm. I should mention it wasn't only the Vietnam War. Of course, we had all been influenced by the civil rights movement. I mean, my family had marched in civil rights marches when I was 11 or 12, not in the South, right. In the North, but nonetheless, we were, very sympathetic to that. But on campus, we had a group, Cicero Wilson was, I think, pretty much the leader of that, of students who were far more sophisticated. I don't know what the right, far more aware of all the aspects of racial injustice than I was. For example, police brutality in black neighborhoods, which even now is, especially now, is a much bigger issue. They were very much aware of that then, having lived in those neighborhoods. And Columbia, the activities of Columbia University itself was something that I was really paying no attention to whatsoever. But the Black Students Union, I think it was called. I don't really remember what the group was called, but they were very conscious of Columbia's effort to essentially take over part of Morningside Park, which was an important Harlem community resource. And then, as we talked about prior to the podcast, create a poor door for the community there and have the bulk of it just be for Columbia. And also, there's something. There's a geological point here that actually is relevant. It sounds funny, but it is. If you're in Morningside Park, you look up at Columbia. Columbia is a cliff, basically.
Right.
And so the psychological impact was this, this powerful and elite institution, Columbia, looking down on Harlem, and then taking a piece of Harlem if it felt like it.
Right.
It was an important psychological dynamic. But anyway, so the Harlem community in particular, and those students who came from that community, were quite conscious of this, whereas the rest of us, until they brought it to our attention, were really pretty much oblivious to it. And by the way, there was in terms of Columbia, there was also an interaction between Columbia and the war in Vietnam, in that Columbia had Defense Department contracts, where Columbia research was being used to support the war in Vietnam. So these were, sort of fine points that most of us, including myself, would have been entirely unaware of, but for these student groups who were bringing them to our attention.
Yeah. So these student groups, do you think that people were naturally drawn to the involvement because of the landscape of American politics at the time? Obviously, it seems like almost everyone who had at least a surface level interest in what was happening in the world was involved in these groups. Having graduated from college just 4 years ago, I would say that a large number of people are somewhat blasé about their political involvement while on campus, while in college. Do you feel like people were naturally drawn to the involvement in that time?
Recognize, first of all, that of course it was only a fraction of the students who really got involved.
Right.
So to generalize about the students overall, you can't.
Yeah.
And also recognize that I don't know if it was a larger group or a smaller group, but a group of at least roughly comparable size was on the other side. The majority coalition had pretty substantial support too, and these are the people who opposed all these protests. Right. So it's very hard to generalize.
So, I guess in your freshman and sophomore year rumblings, right? Can you kind of set the scene for things as they begin to escalate?
Well, yeah. So I arrive on campus in '66. Obviously, spring semester is '67. By the fall of '67, really a lot had crystallized, so that at this point, Rudd was planning his protests. And as we know from later interviews, Rudd was very much aware, planned, expected his protesters, his SDS people, to be beaten by the police. He felt that this would raise general consciousness, would help spark a wider revolution. So he was perfectly willing to manipulate his people to, get beaten up and in the service of consciousness raising.
So for those listening, can you explain succinctly exactly what they were hoping to accomplish with these protests?
Well, by
or what they were planning to accomplish.
by manifesting by making vivid and clear to the public at large, I'm going to put it in the way Rudd might have put it in those terms. The instruments or the pawns of the establishment, i.e. the police, by physically beating the protesters, would highlight the tyranny of the establishment and their unjustness with respect to, the voice, the true voice of the people. By so doing, would change public opinion so that the public would then understand how tyrannical the establishment was, and would begin to side. You would begin to bring more people to the point of view of SDS and Mark Rudd and so forth.
So, in the planning stage, would you say that the protest was even as important as what it would engender in the police force? So, like, what they were actually protesting before Rudd's planned potential attack? Was that even as important as what was expected?
No. Rudd, again, according to later interviews, Rudd actually thought that he could produce a revolution in the United States. By the way, there are those who argue that the Mirror or there was a French campus revolt shortly after the Columbia one, led by Danny Cohn-Bendit, a French fellow, that ultimately toppled the French government. So Rudd wasn't, he misjudged the United States, but more or less what he had in mind worked in France. So he wasn't completely crazy. And yes, so I do think that his vision was that the conflict the visuals of the conflict he was generating were more important than the specific items of protest to him. Yeah, not to his people.
Right. But to him, yeah. As you had said, a strategist.
Right.
He's not someone who's after specific, or he may be after specific goals, but he's really interested
in the big picture.
In the picture.
Yeah.
In the visuals,
right.
in what people will eventually see.
Yes.
People won't see pictures of kids holding signs or
right.
kids lined up in formation. They're going to see protesters
right.
being attacked by policemen.
Right.
So, in the days leading up
right.
to what would end up being a pretty significant moment,
right.
what was going on campus? How did it feel?
Well,
what did it look like?
Certainly, there's no question that it certainly raised consciousness. Obviously, this is what everybody was talking about. Right. There was the student strikes. Classes were suspended, and that's also what enraged the majority coalition, because these people, football players, others, were mostly kids who came from, relatively tough backgrounds, for whom getting into Columbia and being able to get an education here was huge. And they felt these, spoiled rich radicals. And by the way, some of them were quite wealthy. I'm trying to remember her name. It'll come to me later. There were some people from old, very wealthy American families who were very much on the left, and they helped contribute to the image of the whole SDS as spoiled rich kids. So the majority coalition felt these spoiled rich kids are depriving me of my education. There's something to that.
Sure.
And so I talked earlier about how I was friends with the steering committee of SDS, but also because I was an oarsman on heavyweight crew, second string, but still. And I had become friends with some of the football players and so forth who were rowing to stay in shape. I had a lot of conversations with, and they tended toward the majority coalition, so right. I had a lot of conversations with them too. And I argued with both sides, of course. I argued with my majority coalition friends that while I didn't agree with the protesters, they were, as I personally experienced, they were performing a useful function. They had raised my consciousness. I wasn't aware of these issues in the way they were, and so they were bringing these things to the fore, which was useful. I didn't believe in occupying the president's office and things like that. But I thought there was some merit to their position. And of course, my arguments with the SDS people were that I didn't think that violent revolution was the appropriate way to improve life in America. So for me, and I think there were people on campus, some of whom I knew, who were oblivious to the whole thing. I mean, they were pre-meds or or mathematicians, and they just weren't interested.
But they weren't affected by the canceled classes, or they were?
Well, they were, but they would study on their own or whatever. They really didn't.
Driven academics.
Yeah, they
weren't
concerned
about
all
anything
that
else.
concerned. There were people like that too.
Right.
But for most people, this was the main topic of conversation.
Right.
So I don't know if that.
Yeah. So that's the scene.
Right.
Setting the scene, painting the picture.
Right.
So what happens to spark the match? What happens to really get it from 0 to 100?
Well, there were two. First, the black students occupied Hamilton Hall, which is a main classroom center, and there was a police bust at Hamilton Hall in which the police came in and basically took them out without much violence.
Mm-hmm.
The white students and the black students are kind of coordinated with each other. It was sort of a segregated protest because really the black students didn't want white students in Hamilton Hall. Right. And the white students occupied Mathematics Hall, I think Fairweather, and a few other buildings, the Bradlow Library, the president's office. The police dragged them out. There was more violence, and also there were
at the library.
Yeah, and those other places. Okay. But then there was a big campus protest against the police violence, which I was in.
That same day.
No, it was like a day or two later.
Okay.
And at this point, to a very small degree, you could say Rudd had achieved his goal because at least he did get people like myself out protesting police violence.
Right.
But now you have really a very large group, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of students massed on South Field, which is the southern part of the campus, in a protest against the police violence. And Grayson Kirk, the president, and David Truman, the vice president, and I say this with regret because David Truman was a great scholar and a wonderful person. He just handled this very poorly. Basically gave the police orders to clear South Field. And the gates, we don't even know if the police knew this, but the gates at the back of South Field were locked. So where are the students going to go? The police formed a line, a straight line, parallel. So in other words, you have the northern boundary is a line of police facing south.
Right.
The southern boundary are the buildings and the locked gates in between of the students.
Right.
And years later, I imagined the perspective of a young police officer in that line. He knows there's nobody behind him. He sees hundreds of bearded, weird-looking students in front of him.
Dozens deep.
Yeah. And he's told clear South Field. Well, they go in baton swinging and, crack a lot of heads and so on and so forth. They told us that they would also beat up people who carried people to the hospital. But they didn't. So when after standing there and then seeing them clobber everybody, then
you were part. How deep were you? Do you think?
I wasn't near the front.
Okay.
Line.
Okay. So what were you seeing when it started?
I was seeing cops, whacking people in the head, and head wounds bleed a lot, so it looks even worse than it is.
Right.
No, not that some of it wasn't bad, but I saw what looked to me like the cops, beating the heck out of all my classmates. So somebody began to form a first aid squad, and I said, let me help, and we spent the night carrying people to the hospital. But at one point, before I started going to the hospital, I was standing next to a fellow named Vinnie Rigdon. And Vinnie later became a Trappist monk. But anyway, Vinnie was this very right-wing guy who I had met. We were in this one of the rooms in our residence hall was a place which was in theory a place for people to study, but He'd go out there and, argue with people. Vinnie was he was arguing against legalized abortion, and 4 or 5 other guys were, arguing against him, and knocking down his arguments fairly easily. I was in favor of legalized abortion, but I, didn't like the gang up, so I argued Vinnie's side. And even though I didn't believe what I was saying, I was able to basically vanquish these other arguers. After which Vinnie said, "Oh my God, that was great. Are you a Catholic?" And I said, "No." So he said, "Oh, it's too bad. You'd be a terrific Catholic." So he gave me Thomas Merton's Magic 7-Story Mountain book, classic modern Catholic theology, to read, and I gave him some Bertrand Russell, and I don't think he ever read the Russell, but I read the Merton. But anyway, so I'm standing next to Vinnie, and he sees the police clobbering these kids, and he says, they got what they deserved. And it was a moment when I really just felt everything this guy believes is wrong and everything I believe is right. It was just that's not consistent with my true liberal philosophy, which is, you should always be willing to re-examine your positions in view of available evidence. But at that moment, I wasn't willing to re-examine. I was so, and it was an interesting contrast, because some of my football player friends, seeing the results, said, maybe this wasn't such a good idea, But Vinnie, no, he was an ideologue, and right-wing ideologue, and in a way, I suppose you could say he was sort of the mirror image of Rudd. Cold-blooded,
right.
Ideologue. Anyway, so we were carrying students
through the night,
and the next. Now, by about 4 a.m, everybody was pretty much off the field. The police were gone, the students were gone, and I was coming back from my last trip from the hospital, and from the 7th floor of Fernald Hall, which is one of the dormitories across the field from my dormitory, somebody was blasting on their stereo the Phil Oak song. I don't know sure what the title is, but the song goes, "I am just a student, sir, and I'm only here to learn. But it's hard to read by the rising smoke of the books that you like to burn. Well, I'd like to make a promise, and I'd like to make a vow. I've got something to say, sir, and I'm going to say it now." It was, after that horrible night, it was this, great moment, sort of a Pyrrhic, well, not Pyrrhic, but sort of a moral victory in a sense.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the Sulzberger, who was the publisher of the Times, is on the Board of Trustees of Columbia. And the Times editorial pages and news pages for that matter, were unbelievably slanted. Like, the police cleared Southfield without incident. just total lies.
Yeah.
Which, for the first time, not the last time, but for the first time, made me realize that, the good gray Times, which I've been brought up to revere, was just as, could be just as dishonest, biased, and corrupt, intellectually corrupt as anybody else.
So that's the next day that they're reporting that this was a
right.
peaceful clearing of.
Well, eventually they revised it a little bit, but it stayed thoroughly biased.
So what
of the administration?
Day 1, day 2 after this wraps up, obviously the Times at first reports that this had been a peaceful protest and a peaceful clearing.
Yeah.
What is the feeling on campus in the days immediately preceding?
Well, immediately succeeding? Yeah. Well, there was a bunch of different things. First of all, and I don't know how much of this is reporting my own feelings and how much is reporting other people's. To some extent, on some level, we were kind of relieved to things go back to normal. Even people like me, told me, "Please go back to class now."
Yeah.
I think Columbia did make some concessions. the gym in Morningside Park was postponed. They backed off on that. I think, and I'm not sure, that they may even have canceled some of the contracts with the Defense Department. I'm pretty sure they did. Look, I mean, a lot of people in the majority coalition remain very bitter about the interruption of their classes. The SDS people were, of course, some of them were still negotiating whether many were arrested. They were negotiating that. They were negotiating whether they'd be expelled. I mean, there was all kinds of things going on. But I think to some extent, I think most people on campus, I believe, regarded it as an immensely educational experience. Not only in terms of being sensitized to the issues, which, as I said, even for me, and I was relatively involved politically, I had not understood in that kind of detail. And then secondly, it was an education in politics, and how political organization works, and how confrontation works, and how opinions can be changed. And, it was a very informative, very educational. I don't think it truly changed a lot of minds on the issues, particularly sensitized people maybe, but I'll go back to when I first came to Columbia. David Truman spoke to he was dean of the college before he became vice president of the university. So at our freshman orientation, he said that something along these lines. He said, over the next 4 years, you will acquire a wealth of information, theories, facts, opinions, which you will all use to defend the prejudices you have here now today. I don't think he was so far wrong. I don't think it changed people's fundamental orientations, but it at least sensitized people.
Was there an atmospheric change?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting. I've never really thought about that, but I think so. I think it made students feel more empowered. Mm-hmm.
Against the administration, against the police, against the institution.
The police, particularly. And the police it was understood that they were, well, I wouldn't say it was understood. I mean, a lot of people really hated the police as a result. But at a deeper level, on some level, I think people understood that the police are playing a role that they're assigned. They're not the fundamental issue. No, I think it taught people that as individuals and as students and as a group, they can exercise power, and they don't simply have to do what they're told. So,
and did you feel that way as well? Did you feel empowered in that way, or had you come to that realization through your other various involvement?
No, I think it helped me understand that too. Mm-hmm. It's a different kind of power than just the power to vote. It's the power to organize, to protest. Of course, we saw that in the civil rights movement, but for those of us who were just a bit too young to have gone down south, for example, I think this, brought that lesson home more personally.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. All right, I think we'll stop it there, but we'll revisit this obviously as it colors the next couple of years of your political involvement, graduation from Columbia, involvement in a million other things politically. Cool. Thanks.
Thanks.